right, welcome everyone to today's research seminar. It's great to have several people here in the room and also online. And thank you very much for joining us today for our seminar series. So this is a series that we have started a couple of years ago, and it's really to share knowledge, to understand each other's perspectives on sustainable development, to share our interdisciplinary research and discuss it. And we do so with speakers from internally in the Institute, also from across Monash University, from other universities in Australia, and also international. And so it's an academically oriented research seminar series. So often we have people talking about their papers or ongoing research. And I'm very pleased that today we got Saurabh. But before I do your introduction, I should acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we're based and pay my respect to them, the people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respect to the elders past and present. So yeah, we've got Saurabh, Arora here. Saurabh and I go back a long time. We both looked a bit younger when we started our collaboration. Was it like 25, no, probably 20 years ago in Eindhoven? We both supervised together a PhD student. And that was a great start. And then Saurabh moved on to join SPRU at Sussex University, which is the Science Policy and Research Unit. And for those familiar with research on innovation studies and sustainability transitions, SPRU has always been considered as one of the founding places of and one of the thriving places where a lot of the intellectual origins are from both innovation studies and sustainability transitions. You've also spent time in the US, at Minnesota, I think, and before that, obviously, you lived in the Netherlands, and before that, you grew up in India and you were trained as an engineer, which is also true for me. And sometimes I say I'm still recovering from being an engineer, turned into social scientist. Having heard you speak the last couple of days in several events, including the NEST workshop and also a methods workshop you provided to us on decolonization of research methods, I think you've truly become a social scientist. And I find listening to you always very inspiring through intellectual. So I'm really pleased to have you here for this research seminar. Before we move on to your presentation, just a few practicalities. So we have about between 30 and 40 minutes for the presentation, and then the rest of the time will be a Q&A. We've got a few people in the room here, a few online. If you want to ask a question, it's probably best just to raise your hand or shout out if you're online. So we can give you the mic to ask the question. Please think of any good questions. I know Saurabh likes discussions and debates, so feel free to bring some comments in that direction as well. All right, Saurabh, floor is yours.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you very much for the introduction.
We lost the sound in the room.
Used to these microphones.
We will turn on the mic. Just give us a second.
Forgive me for my my lack of technical skills. So yeah, I was saying this paper is in process. So it's currently being written with my friend and colleague, Barbara van Dijk, who is based at ULB in Brussels. And of course, it builds on much past work. So therefore, I'm also expressing gratitude to my other collaborators on whom it's been, some of the work has been directly done together with them as well. So this paper is focused on so-called new genomic techniques, which I'm sure some of you have heard about. CRISPR-Cas9, the genome editing technology that was developed by Jennifer Doudna, and Jennifer Doudna actually got a Nobel Prize for it later on, and it is very widely being used all around the world for genome editing of all kinds of crops, agricultural things, but also it was used very scandalously by a Chinese doctor on a couple of babies a couple of years ago, and he lost his job as a result of that. He supposedly was treating the babies and without getting the right ethical approval. So then he was fired. And then I think he has now been reinstated in his job. So he's quite a celebrated genome editing scholar otherwise in the medical field. So it has multiple different applications all around. Our work essentially is focused on agriculture. And in agriculture, many of the activists who are critical of genetic technologies, they do not like this term, new genomic techniques. They claim that there is not much difference between these techniques and what they have already been fighting for decades, that is genetic modification or genetic engineering of crops. So there was some resistance in naming the paper in this way as well. But I think it's important to be critical of whatever new thing is coming up. And in fact, there is particularly in relation to these technologies and in terms of the futures that are being imagined through these new technologies. And also, some of the newer trends are moving in all kinds of different directions, which I wanted to talk about, but I didn't find the time to complete that work, which is the combination of artificial intelligence and synthetic biology, which is being dubbed today generative biology. So there are all kinds of somewhat scary dystopian and of course with a very big utopian promise that's being attempted in this field. But let me start a little bit with the vast literature on sustainable futures. Future studies is of course a huge body of work, and obviously I can't do justice to that immense body of literature, but I thought maybe I could cover some strands of the literature on so-called sustainable futures. And here, to some extent, imaginations are dominated by eco-modernism. And eco-modernism, of course, going back to this manifesto by the Breakthrough Institute, which I'm citing here, Asafou Jay et al., there's about 15, 20 authors involved there, promoted all kinds of eco-modern techno fixes. They said, all newer technologies, don't be depressed about the state of the world, environmentally speaking. We can decouple environmental degradation from technological advance, from growth, from economic progress. And that decoupling was their main aim. And they promoted all kinds of technologies through which, of course, everything can be addressed. More critical scholars like, people like myself and many colleagues argue that these eco-modern techno-fixes are also geared towards a particular imagination of control. They want to control reality of all kinds, not just nature and cultures, but also governments, markets, so-called regimes, infrastructures, innovations, and so on and so forth. And techno-fixes here can include perhaps most hubristically climate geoengineering, which tries to control the entire planet. Sheila Jasanoff has recently called that imagination, that centralized imagination, treating the Earth, spaceship Earth. And she distinguishes it from stewardship, so spaceship versus stewardship. And of course, there's other work that has been happening for a while, even in the most interesting fields for sustainability, such as conservation and rewilding as conservation, which of course I am otherwise a big proponent of. And that's where they are trying to introduce species that are extinct for a very long time. So they call it de-extinction of certain particular species. And of course, it looks cool, the woolly mammoth coming back or the dodo coming back, but the imaginations of control behind it and ignorance or marginalization of all kinds of relations into which those species end up is of course very interesting as well. And perhaps these uncertainties are not being taken seriously in this imagination. And of course, sometimes people realize these problems and there is attention to justice within these, in relation to these eco-modern fixes. So for example, in recent work, one of my colleagues and others are trying to also talk about justice in relation to technologies such as large solar and what it means to transform that towards solar that does not build upon huge appropriation of huge parcels of land. So for example, to realize what they call brighter solar futures. And more interestingly, there is of course much other literature on degrowth, on just transitions as a whole. And degrowth, obviously, as you might know, tries to emphasize the importance of living simply. So voluntary simplicity, for lower material throughput in economies. And in this imagination, it's not just voluntary frugality or voluntary poverty or voluntary simplicity that is at the core, but also what degrowth scholars might building on this, but this scholar Singh, who talked about differently abundant futures. So it's also about promoting alternatives, such as commoning, such as bicycling, and all kinds of other things. Bicycling also for transportation, not just for individual persons riding. Transportation of goods, I mean. So there's all these different, arguments about reducing, but reducing at the same time as promoting alternatives. So that's why the differently abundant futures. Now, recently, in a sort of a discussion on justice and sustainability, particularly in the transitions literature, there's again 10 authors involved there, I think, Flora Avellino and others, where they call for just socio-ecological futures. Here, otherwise, they're trying to move beyond many sustainability transitions models that might downplay the different multiple ontological possibilities. And they restrict the imagination in terms of where we can go. And this is something I talked about already on Friday in the lecture that I did at the NEST conference. And to move beyond these, there's, of course, many other discussions on futures as well in the last few years. And here people argue, well, it's not just the question of prefigurative imagination. So imagination's prefiguring the kind of realities we want to realize, but actually already existing praxis in other ways of being, other ways of knowing, other ways of living that are trying to realize futures otherwise while being impinged by continued coloniality. And here the importance of moving beyond a singular universal global future to many different global futurities, let's say, of people co-becoming, people and non-people, non-humans co-becoming together, and also going beyond modern imaginaries of change by highlighting all kinds of plural realities. Realities approached differently by different peoples, depending upon their different ontologies, and the potentialities inherent to many different colonized cultures of the world, past and present. Potentialities for the future. So these multiple divergent possibilities are sometimes theorized in particular regional contexts and continents, for example, such as, or relation to particular peoples, such as Afrofuturism or indigenous futurism. Equally, some people digging deeper point to particular relations and particular practices, such as those of care, that might be grounded in anti-colonial resistance or indigenous autonomy, and therefore they argue that they're driven towards promoting life-giving futures. Others call for reparative futures to address injustices that are associated with these histories of racist coloniality and other forms of intersectional oppressions that people, communities have been facing for the last few hundred years. Rob, you'll tell me about the time a little bit, yeah? I think I might overshoot. Equally in the design space, design and heritage space, so to speak, there's a lot of discussion on decolonization in terms of building futures that are communal. In the Latin American context, that is translated as comunalidad, and somebody I've worked with is also examining those in relation to energy. So he's not interpreting community energy as community energy, but rather as communal energy. So here the idea is you build on all kinds of craft and artisanal traditions in order to realize futures otherwise. And finally, if you want to talk about these things, it's equally important to point to the fact that energy or agriculture or a particular craft tradition doesn't just sit on its own. It requires all kinds of ecological foundation, it requires connections with other activities, other ways of sustaining oneself. So housing relies on water relies on agriculture relies on clothing, and so on and so forth. The connections between them points to the flourishing of entire worlds otherwise, which might again be structured by multiple ontologies, which is of course foregrounded by many different indigenous social movements. What Escobar calls these movements try to do, politics that are pluriversal. Okay. If there's any question about anything, please do ask anytime. Yeah, you don't have to wait till the end. So please just interrupt me and ask questions. Now, of course, I am very much sympathetic and supportive of many of these arguments, and I think these are thinking about life, futures for us, for our world, that might otherwise be obscured if we stick to just the more dominant eco-modernist traditions. But I also wonder, well, many times in these studies, it is not clearly articulated or conceptualized. What is it that needs transforming? What is the political formation? What is the world that these relations of colonialism have built that need changing? And of course, realizing that transforming our world is, as you know, the agenda that from the UN as well. And here too, well, what is this world? What world are we talking about is not clearly articulated. And in my view, it requires attending to all kinds of entrenched relations that make our world, that drive these sustainability challenges. And in my work with my co-author, Andy Sterling in particular, but also others, we see this world, we are trying to recognize this world, articulate, conceptualize this world that is much more expansive than capitalism, that includes all kinds of modern nation states, as well as institutions, sciences and technologies, relations between them, as colonial modernity. And in that sense, we are also trying to go beyond modernity as a political formation or as a set of societies that often obscure the colonial constitutions of the modern world. So therefore, we say it's important to put these two terms together, colonial and modernity, and that's what helps us make sense of the world in which we live. So the world in which we live is colonial modern. This means obviously decolonizing all kinds of relations across innovations, which I also talked about on Friday, across markets, businesses, not something, nothing I have attempted yet, but there's literature on it, on particularly on decolonizing business and cultures and so on and so forth, much out there. And of course, on decolonizing relations in and with nature and pluralization of nature itself, perhaps. No, as I already said, this is the conceptualization of these relations that constitute colonial modernity across global South and North is sometimes neglected even in studies that are trying to articulate decolonial futures. Now, then we ask, well, is a similar neglect found in other sustainability studies, for example, sustainability transitions? I would argue, yes, definitely overall, but some global South studies do observe both connections between, let's say, the South and the North, as well as differences. So in terms of differences, obviously, they highlight how the North is considered prominent in all kinds of new technologies, while South is oftentimes seen as a repository of deficiencies of all kinds, including having failing states and non-democratic systems and people not having trust among each other, and also in terms of climate discussions as having limited adaptive capacity, both in urban and rural regions. So the South seems to host much backwardness, but colonial relations between and within the South are often unseen. And colonial relations, particularly, as I've argued, between not just between regions and peoples, but between ways of knowing, ways of living, which we might call worlds, where natures and cultures come together in different ways. Equally, when connections are seen, and North is seen to transfer green technologies to the South, North is extracting resources from the South through global capitalism. That is also oftentimes articulated as unjust. For example, mining that happens in the Congo, and so on and so forth. And of course, in lithium mining, etc., is also highlighted. North also promotes neoliberalism in the South. So through these connections, these kinds of things are articulated. And South, at the same time, points out, sometimes it's rarely acknowledged in the transitions literature, that look, people in the South, particularly some activists, are saying that these are neo-colonial relations. But beyond mentioning that, there is no deep analysis of what these Southern activists are trying to say. So North-South connections are seen, but not grasped, not analyzed as coloniality that might constitute all kinds of regimes and socio-technical systems. Okay, so this was sort of part of the literature review that was done for the paper that we published last year, and that was called Colonial Modernity and Sustainability Transitions, a Conceptualization in 6 Dimensions. The paper is cited here. Of course, what I'm trying to get at is that these colonial relations that constitute modernities are quite invisibly entrenched, that they're not even seen, and they're routinely reproduced. And while being invisibly entrenched, they're routinely reproduced. That means that there's something quite dangerous about them, because we're not facing them. And these are not just, in my view, connections that could be seen as threads or ties in a network, because they are rather too knotty for that. That means they're rather too difficult to change. So perhaps it's better to see these connections, these colonial relations that I'm trying to highlight, as knots that are not easily untangled. And each resists transformation Also, as knots can be bent, knots can be resized across time and space, but they remain more or less the same in terms of the knotting style. And here, the mathematical field of knots tries to study topology. And that's another body of work that I'm trying to develop slowly over the last year on what topology might mean to understand colonial modernity and other worlds. And so hopefully I'll be able to present it at another time soon. And I'm also there building on some of the weaving work we did on Thursday. So on how perhaps we can approach worlding topologically through practices of weaving, felting, which is also a textile tradition, wool, and knotting. In this case, those are all here, knotting also in carpets. That's ongoing work. It's been going on for a year. It's hard work because you're relying on artisanal traditions, artisanal practices in order to theorize about how worlds are made. So it's not like you can rely on ready-made philosophy somewhere and just run with it from, viva the French. So unfortunately, it's not like that. So it's taking some time, but I hope to produce something by the end of this year, at least, to share. Now, going back to the paper that was published last year, we articulated 6 different relations. These 6 different relations, we said, are interwoven with each other. The first of these relations, obviously, is assuming comprehensive superiority. And here, of course, central to the modern world has been superiorities that have been assumed on the basis of race, but also equally Islamophobia, equally epistemological and ontological superiorities against other ways of knowing and living. Second dimension or relation that we talk about of colonial modernity is assertions of military supremacy. And here, of course, these are multiple different forms of violences that are inflicted on people who are othered on the basis of those categories of race, religion, tribe, caste, and so on and so forth, and region and nation as well. Unfortunately, this goes on to this day, as we see what's going on in many parts of the world, including Palestine, particularly at the moment. The third one we talk about is expanding toxic extraction. Here, it's about designing projects that are geared towards doing extraction from social kinds of extraction about epistemologies, knowledges, wisdoms, but also of material objects and resources. I will talk about that in more depth in a minute. These last 3, I am not talking so much in detail today. Also in the interest of time, also because my work on new genomic techniques in relation to these 3 is still ongoing. And here, of course, the first one, most prominent one in terms of writings and perhaps in terms of shaping our world as well, is enforcement of gender domination. And here it's normalization of colonial modern relations of gender, particularly the gender binaries, and obscuring racial differences between different gender categories, obscuring racial differences within gendered categories. So here, there's of course the concept of political intersectionality, but we also in this paper try to propose another way of thinking about it, which we call infrasectionality, which is about how each of these sections, whether they are identified on the basis of race or gender, are constituted from within for all kinds of heterogeneous relations. Again, work that needs to be further developed, but we put it out there for maybe somebody will get inspired to take it on board. And then appropriation of cultural privileges. And here, of course, the question of unequal exchange between regions comes to mind. Ecologically unequal exchange, with the Barcelona crowd has written about quite a lot. Before they became degrowth, they also used to write about ecologically unequal exchanges between the North and the South, between developed countries and developing countries, in order to produce inequalities in wealth, obviously, but also epistemological privileges, concentrating cultural privileges, and so on and so forth, which we see, of course, very widely around the world at the moment. And finally, extending controlling imaginations. This is, of course, my colleague Andy Sterling has written quite a lot about in the last 10 years. And it's about enacting imaginations, colonial imaginations of control over not just other people, but also entire objectified natures. Yeah, and each of these obviously has a decolonial counterpoints, and I can talk about that later if there are questions. Now, let me dig into some of these dimensions, some of these relations, and I will talk about 3 of them. I hope I'll have enough time to do that. So the first one is obviously the assumption of comprehensive superiority. So some people's lives, some people's knowledges, some people's ways of being can matter less than others. And here people are othered using categories of race, religion, nation, tribe, and so even class, one might say, in some societies now. And they are therefore, because they are other, they're considered as inferior to self. So othering not in order to appreciate this other people who are different, but in order to consider them as inferior. And while this is done, colonial histories, these relations of inferiority, the relations of hierarchy might themselves be obscured. And as these relations are obscured, decolonial alternatives are obscured. In the environmental justice literature, environmental studies, more sustainability literature, these assumptions of comprehensive superiority are seen as manifesting in the form of what I think it was Laura Pulido has called environmental racism. And of course, much other literature on environmental injustices and climate injustices. So people have written about contaminated soils and waste being dumped on communities of color, and obviously the widespread vulnerability now associated with climate disruptions, which impinge most heavily on people who have contributed very little to the climate crises that we see around the world. And also here, including this important dimension of nature, the idea that nature can only be known by modern science. It's in a way an attempt to colonize truth itself, that only we know what is objectively possible, or what is objectively the world, and the rest of the world that approaches nature in a different way is producing cultural meanings, not objective natural meanings. So only modern science is therefore natural science and objectively superior to all other ways of knowing and being that are deemed merely cultural. And here, in terms of NGTs, new genomic techniques, what we have looked at in relation to this relation is that biofortification is, do you all know what biofortification is? So, industrial processed food, I don't know, some of you, we all have eaten cereals, right? So many of these cereals, they come fortified with iron or vitamin whatever B, or so Kellogg's even does it. So that's called fortification. You add these things on top. Biofortification is you actually develop the crop in a way that it produces that whatever vitamin or iron that you need. So producing more vitamins or iron out of the crop itself that is harvested rather than adding them later. So this is done through breeding, obviously. And most of the biofortified crops that are sold around there, a lot of them are cassava, wheat, rice, all kinds, cassava, of course, many parts of sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of Pakistani wheat that you might buy is biofortified. Pakistani rice, a lot of the times is biofortified. Golden rice, you might have heard about. Golden rice, nobody? Golden rice, beta carotene, enhanced rice that is actually golden. They first floated it in China. China didn't buy it. Then they went to Bangladesh in 2017. Bangladesh is still deliberating. Then 7 years later, then they went to the Philippines. Philippines bought it. Yes, we will release golden rice for our populations. And then the Supreme Court of the Philippines, at the last minute, just a few months ago, said, no way are we releasing this. So far as I know, most of these biofortified crops that are out there that are being consumed are not genetically modified. So this is, again, a future thing. This is not something that is happening today, apart from 2. One is a tomato that you can buy it on Japanese supermarket shelves. It's a Sicilian tomato, deeply red. What does it do? It produces something like a gamma aminobutyric acid. It's called GABA. Gamma aminobutyric acid, GABA, which it seems Japanese love as a dietary supplement. I didn't know that. And that's been built into, through CRISPR, through genome editing, into this tomato that is being sold and bought in Japan now. There's another one, soybean. It's high oleic acid soybean that is being grown currently in Canada and in the US. And I think that's also genome edited. But apart from those, I don't know any other genome edited biofortified crops. So as I said, these are all thinkings about the future. Now, just as my story about it, there are about, according to the UN, 2023 report published by the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization based in Rome, they said 690 to 783 million people went structurally hungry in 2022. Well, that's about a tenth of the population of the world that went structurally hungry. In addition, they argued, and more damningly, 42% of the world's population could not afford a healthy diet in 2021. Now, in parts of the world where I've worked, and I grew up in South Asia and East Africa, this percentage is higher than 70. I think it's 72% in India, in South Asia, and 77% in East Africa. In Europe and North America, this share of the population was just 1.4%. So we are above 70 in South Asia and literally 1.4% in the US and in Europe. So the FAO and the UN, of course, they recognize these inequalities, but do not say anything about how these huge inequalities come into place, how these huge inequalities are sustained. They do not, therefore, talk about colonial relations that have produced these inequalities and then sustain them today. So colonial relations, obviously, of extreme violence are obscured, that inflict genocides and plunder, of course. As I already argued, colonial relations that represent a diverse range of indigenous and southern cultures as deficient, as lacking in goods that can supply the world and knowledges that can help the world, knowledges that have sustained entire societies and cultures over time. Colonial relations of rule that divide racialized peoples from each other and produce hierarchical social orders, those are also obscured. So rather than helping to struggle against these colonial relations and transforming the world that has been built on its basis, the UN and the FAO present malnutrition and hunger as problems of underproduction, inadequate production, and inadequate consumption capacities of people in the South themselves. So obviously, once you've situated it like that, how are you going to address it? You're going to biofortify crops. A technical solution, a techno fix in the typical eco-modern thing that I was talking about earlier is promoted. Now, it is also true that as they promote biofortify, they also observe that nutritional value of crops is falling in the last 70 odd years. I don't know if any of you have seen articles about it, that there's a crisis, nutritional value of vegetables. Vegetables are not as nutritious as they used to be. Wheat and rice are not as nutritious as they used to be. And that is sometimes in more of the recent discourses that is claimed to be a problem associated with climate change. It's climate change that is producing these nutritional deficiencies, reduction in nutritional value of our crops that we eat, the foods that we eat. And of course, there's other work that has shown, but perhaps it's not climate change alone. Maybe climate change is playing a role, but there's also the growth of industrial agriculture around the world in the same period, during which immense amount of reduction of agricultural biodiversity has taken place. Nutritious varieties of rice have been put aside for lab-driven varieties of rice. Nutritious varieties of wheat and other kinds of grains are not being consumed. Why is most of the world consuming rice and wheat today rather than all kinds of other cereals that are possible and that are available out there? Yeah. So that's pushed aside, and the rise of industrial agriculture is not being taken into account. So to biofortify crops, therefore, becomes the answer. Rob, time? Yeah, I was going to say, maybe try and stay on the 10 minutes. Oh, another 10 minutes? Okay, I'll do my best. So to fortify crops, therefore, these new genetic techniques are being promoted, such as CRISPR, and they're not incidentally being considered superior to all the other agroecological non-industrial varieties, thousands of them that are still alive and sometimes thriving in certain, particularly First Nation societies that are taken into account. They assert the superiority of new genomic techniques over conventional breeding techniques for biofortification. So it's within the modern technical arena that this discussion takes place. And of course, it's argued that new genomic techniques are quicker than conventional breeding, which is the dominant way in which biofortification is done. There is stronger possibility of gaining optimal control. As I said, control is always underlying these eco-modern imaginations, techno-fixes. Its multiplexity is possible so that you're not just aiming for one phenotypic trait. So you're not just aiming for, let's say, beta carotene or a particular vitamin, but you can build multiple traits into a single crop through it's called multiplex genome editing that you can do with CRISPR. And it's easier to get regulatory approvals because if no transgenics are involved, if you're just editing something, you're not adding gene from another species, then it's easier, there's claim to get regulatory approval. Now, they largely ignore the existence of traditional indigenous varieties as alternatives to biofortification. When those crops and varieties are brought into the picture, they're called orphan crops. Orphan crops such as millets, orphan because they were not targeted for ostensible improvement by earlier variants of industrial agriculture, earlier waves of industrial agriculture, or they're called left behind alleles. These are left behind alleles in traditional varieties of rice and wheat. So, and then they are presented as if they can be still used for developing new varieties. So millets become targets of biofortification as well now. So that takes me into the next dimension or relation that I want to develop that I will not do today, but I will move to something perhaps that is even more disturbing than what I've just talked about. That's about the assertion of military supremacy. And here, of course, extreme violence is clear. They often use these assumptions of one nature, one ontology, one science to claim that other worlds have died off and that there is no indigenous sovereignty outside of modern nation states. And that, of course, helps to obscure the genocidal violence, etc., that continues to take place. Now, in 2024, there were record investments in military research by the US. I think they invested something like $145 billion US. That far exceeds anything that the US does in civilian R&D. Military R&D, therefore, central to many innovations that are also promoted for sustainability, including all kinds of digital technologies, including artificial intelligence and so on and so forth. Now, what I want to talk about in relation to the new genomic techniques today is this project called Insect Allies. There was DARPA. Anybody knows what DARPA is? Is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency of the United States. They're developing this thing called HEGAs. So usually when we do genetic engineering, we do what is called vertical genetic engineering, which means new kinds of seeds are developed that are then grown all over the place, like I talked about earlier. But they say, no, this is horizontal genetic alteration, which means they will release aphids, whiteflies, and leafhoppers that are carrying genetically modified viruses that will go on to a mature standing crop and give it climate resilience. So it'll touch that crop and make it develop certain kinds of traits. So they say this is horizontal transmission to confer protective traits to the targeted plants. So already when this project was floated, 2016, people started smelling DARPA. Why is DARPA doing this? Why does DARPA want to worry about US food security? People thought, oh, this is a bioweapon. So a paper was published, I think, in Science or Nature, Reeves et al. That I'm citing here, that criticized DARPA for developing bioweapons. DARPA obviously immediately denied this, said, no, we are not developing. That would be anyway in breach of the, the Biological Weapons Convention since 1975, of which the US is a signatory. So they said it's basically purely to protect food security in the US, and nothing else. But they also agreed and admitted that, look, this is a revolutionary technology, and all kinds of revolutionary technologies are dual use anyway. They can be used for war, but they can also be used to sustain peace. And Donna Haraway very famously has called these technologies death-dealing and life-affirming, dual use. Obviously, when they argue for dual use, DARPA and its allies, they do not talk about the fact that none of this dual use happens in a political vacuum. We must ask death-dealing for whom, life-affirming for whom, particularly in the United States, the context of the US, which not only invests more than any other country in its military. In 2023, it invested 916 US billion, so almost $1 trillion in the military. This was nearly 40% of the entire military expenditure in the world of 2,400 billion. So, and remembering the fact that for the US external threats that they're supposedly responding to. So this was not just climate threats that they said they were responding to. They also said, somebody might come and spray herbicides on our maize crop in Iowa. What are we going to do? We need to protect it. So we will release these viruses through these insects into that standing crop. But obviously, people also say, well, in the US, there are plenty of internal enemies, particularly Black and indigenous communities that have been historically targeted by state institutional violence. So none of that is lost on critics. And now finally, I will move to the last dimension that I've got, which is about toxic extraction. And of course, here it's, I think it's pretty clear to see. I don't have to go much longer about this. It's about taking socio-ecological relations around the world and turning them into resources for unbridled extraction and leaving a whole range of toxic trails behind. And this is not just something that has an unintended consequence of modernity, of modern projects. I argue that this is a design aspect of modern projects. And this is particularly clear to see here in the case that we've got of Brazilian firm called Suzano. I don't know if any of you've heard of Suzano. Suzano is the world's largest pulp manufacturer. Now, it has already, I think, 250 million odd hectares of plantations out there. It claims that another 250 million are required in the next couple of decades because the demand for solid wood will rise threefold. And of course, some of that might be driven by sustainability ideas, such as we need to have wooden skyscrapers and so on and so forth. So of course, a lot of the times land has been taken away from indigenous peoples, and it's in Brazil that we are talking about. Plantations, toxic extraction on plantations begins with extraction of land. Such extraction, of course, difficult to justify these days without association with progress. And that progress, of course, comes in the form of climate change and sustainability nowadays. As I said, Suzano is genetically, as the world's largest pulp manufacturer, Suzano is modifying trees today, genetically engineering trees, particularly eucalyptus trees, I think others, and together with an Israeli company called Futura Gene. The plan is to make sure that these trees don't have high lignin content, so they're not tough, they're very easy to break and turn into pulp, as well as they supposedly will grow anyway. They've crossed it with a weed called Arabidopsis. Arabidopsis basically grows anyway. So they are agreeing that these trees will basically grow anyway. So the imperative is more wood on less land. It'll grow under any conditions. And of course, the plan right now is to grow 1.2 million hectares. But as I said, they want to do this extraction on 250 million hectares of land fueled by this technology or fueling this technology to do that. I leave it with my concluding remarks. Of course, we've just described one possible assemblage of these knots that constitute colonial modernity in the case of new genomic techniques of 3 kinds. There are many other kinds, unfortunately. I already mentioned generative biology and so on. And why is it important to do that? This is a quote from Baldwin: "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." So it's really important to confront these colonial constituting relations, knots that shape our world, which is trying to eat up, destroy, damage all kinds of other possibilities, or subsume them, assimilate them in order to serve its own goals and ends. And that's it. Crucial to focus on pluriversal decolonization, also through supporting anti-colonial resistance of all kinds of Brazilians that I talked about who are resisting against these plantations, for example. I stop here. Sorry, I took longer than I knew. I had a lot of slides, so sorry. But there's still 15, 20 minutes. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Saurabh. I think that was fantastic. I don't know where you store all that knowledge, but you just keep producing more and more, and it's great that you can share that with us. So yeah, we've got about 15 minutes for questions and comments, both online or in the room.
Shireen's got her hand up.
Oh yeah, Shireen, you got your hand up?
No, it was an applause rather than a hand up, actually.
All right. Okay, well, you're allowed to applaud as well. Okay, well, I'll ask a question then first, and please jump in or let us know if you want to have a question. My question is, like, this is a huge project of us, like trying to deal with colonial modernity and defining the transformation of our world as moving away from colonial modernity. It's a massive project, and some would say it's maybe even undoable. So what gives you hope that this is possible, or what will be the conditions under which this transformation can be achieved?
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Good question indeed. And it's not like I am constantly excited about the possibilities. It is obvious. Sometimes doing this work is quite difficult as well, because it's to see US military investing so much money in shaping the future of our world is not an easy thing to digest. I think the hope really comes from all kinds of movements, social movements around the world that are valiantly fighting while putting their lives on, on the line. People like me, of course, sit in our comfy academic offices and do this safe work of talking about it in academic gatherings. But I think without those frontline workers and defenders and activists and social movement people, we would be nothing. So they are the ones who give hope, because if they can carry on in the extremely adverse circumstances that they do, and Sumit knows a few of them too, we talked about it in India. I mean, these people are extremely brave. Their necks might be cut by the corporations that they're trying to fight against deforestation, but they carry on a decade and a half later, still as strong as they were before they were attacked. So they are the ones who give me hope, and they are the ones who keep me going, saying that I have to fulfill my responsibility. If these guys are doing so much, I can at least do this much. So that's what it is. And in terms of the conditions that you're talking about, I think the world is bigger, vaster in terms of possibilities than any of us individually or even collectively as a sustainability community can imagine. I think we need to, that wonder about the world, that how so much is possible. And so much is real, even today, so much is in existence. It's just that it is very neatly obscured by these veneers of coloniality. And that's what another thing to keep remembering, keep reminding oneself that there is much out there in terms of possibilities that is not being currently grasped.
Yeah.
Or even
so
seen.
It's pointing towards the possibilities already unfolding in the present, even though those are still facing massive challenges.
Massive. And that's why it's important to confront this formation, this world that we are building, that we have been building for the last 500 years.
I'll ask is there a question online or not yet? Oh, there you go. Got a few here. When you go first.
Yeah. So thanks for that amazing talk, Saurabh. My question kind of also moves back to the workshop and the Nest conference that we had, where you also kind of spoke about decolonial kind of, literature around that. And while you were, while you were talking, I was also kind of reflecting on my kind of background, where I come from, a country which was, was governed, or I would say ruled by the British colonial, era for 200 years. And then I was kind of, while I was reflecting on, I was thinking, oh, well, what my ancestors were like, or what were their practices. So my question to you is, especially in, global South countries, where you still kind of want to be like North, like Western, and in that case you are losing out a lot of other things that you should have maybe, or you should preserve. So my question to you is, how do you see that, being challenged, or how do you see, where is the stop there, where, because right now, although we are talking about it, there are people who are thinking about, how to get more modern, how to, get all these gadgets, how to use artificial intelligence. If you look into the courses that are being introduced in countries, in India, I would clearly see that, there is an upsurge of all these courses around AI, cyber security, blah, blah, blah. So how do you see not following things that are being kind of proposed, and, kind of thinking about in a decolonial terms?
Thank you, Sumit. Look, this is a struggle. We have to remember it's a struggle. We might be fighting a Goliath, is that the way it goes? David is the bigger one, or Goliath is the bigger? Anyway, whatever it is, I have to forget which one is which. So that's maybe my good thing about sometimes that, sometimes that forgetting that we are fighting such a big behemoth gives also the energy to carry on. That, otherwise sometimes this depression or whatever, the lack of hope can take over. But it is, one has to remember, this is not, there's no easy game. This is a constant struggle, and we are all waging this struggle. And of course, there's extreme power, concentrated power and privilege of all kinds on the other sides that want to build completely different realities that serve those ends and those interests. But that doesn't mean we give up our struggle. And I think, again, it's important to remember people in much harder times have struggled against such forces. And so, of course, we can do that. And going back to your other point about time, this is not so much about going back in time. Yeah, often decolonization is presented as the revival of a particular past of our ancestors. It's not, in my view, it's not that. I think, in my view, decolonization is a question of futures. What kind of futures do we want to see and realize? So what is it that we need to fight against, and what is it that we need to build with? Yeah, and I think that's why it's important to remember that what we are talking about, comprehensive superiority, that's about certain kinds of inequalities. Then we're talking about cultural privileges, another certain kinds of, it's about egalitarianism. It's about conviviality between different worlds and ways of being and coexistence of those. So this is what decolonization is. And of course, it might require sometimes to go back in time and seek inspiration, but that inspiration doesn't mean reconstruction of the past. Otherwise, you're getting into the de-extinction space. Yeah. All right, Rachel, you had a question, huh?
It's more to something I'm just curious about, I guess, that we're sort of striving for a new future, potentially without looking at what we can use from the past knowledges. And so when you were talking about the crop fortification, this is something I'm really curious about. Like, we're looking to strive to make new resilient crops or whatever, whereas in the past they would have done crop rotation and help the soil regenerate. And I appreciate that land is scarce and we're using it for all sorts of different things, populations are growing, but with knowledges that are there already, that we could potentially have the minerals or whatever in the soil if we rotated. Yeah, I'm just more curious as to why we're trying to sort of build in something when potentially it may be something we could use from the past, if my question makes sense.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. There is a huge body called the Indian Agricultural Research Institutions, IARI. Similarly, these exist in most of the other parts, most other countries in the world. They are, in India, I think there are thousands, if not more than 100,000 scientists employed for IARI. They've got centers all over the country. These people need work. What are they going to do? They're going to develop these biofortified varieties along with CGIAR in a CGIAR program called Harvest Plus, which is supposedly the world's largest program to develop these biofortified varieties. That's what they will do. This is what they're trained to do. This is what their skills allow them to do. Plus, there are corporations that want to sell those varieties. So I think these are some of the interests behind why we opt for some of the very dominant interests, powerful interests behind why we opt for a biofortified variety rather than a heritage heirloom variety that farmers have been cultivating for thousands of years. And that is perhaps not so easily replicable or even admissible in a monocultural plantation, which is also the industrial model of agriculture in which we operate. So I think these are some of the forces why we are doing these kinds of things. But of course, there are many others that I haven't even touched upon. Yeah. I hope, I hope it's somewhat, did I address your question? Yeah, okay, good.
Thanks, Saurabh. You mentioned, and it touches a little bit on what you were just talking about, you said that colonial modernity is more expansive than capitalism.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether, in terms of what needs to be transformed, I'm wondering whether the profit motive is, or financialization or growth, or however you want to call it, whether that is a crystallization of colonial modernity in terms of how we design production and consumption systems. Is it something that can be understood as, as a crystallization of all of those aspects? I'm thinking about Rachel's question in terms of why do we not do things the way we used to do? And my gut feeling is, well, that doesn't make as much money.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm just curious your reflections on that.
Yeah, thank you, Paris. No, indeed, there is the question of money. There's the question of capital. There's the question of return on investment. There's the question of the corporate scientists as well, employed by corporations, developing these kinds of things. But I think, like I said also on Friday, it was, I think, that we should never put the state's agency outside of our purview. So modern nation states are not just handmaidens or servants to capital. I think it would be a mistake to reduce them to that. They have their own agency. So as we are trying to fight some corporations which are doing these kinds of things and just questioning sustainability that can be delivered by the profit motive or individual property rights, alongside that, we've also got to question and critique and look at the history of the modern nation state. And it's particularly important it's particularly important in India today too, but it's particularly important in settler colonial contexts such as Australia. What the state has done here is extreme violence of many kinds, and the privileges that have been built on the basis of that violence, unless we confront that history and how that history shapes the modern nation state here in the present, I think capitalism can become a distraction to that analysis. Yeah, although I'm all in favor of doing that kind of work as well, obviously. But I think we need to look at the state as well. And we need to look at what it does over time in promoting, building colonial modern worlds, and actively destroying, sending militaries to destroy other worlds, other ways of being. Yeah.
I have one last question, unless someone online wants to jump in who didn't have an opportunity yet. No. My question is around, I mean, the project of modernity is very much one of science and technology. And so when you think about transformation as a way of moving away from that, what's the role of science and technology in decolonizing modernity? And is this a question around ownership and access to science and technology, or is there something else?
Thank you, Rob. For me, it's not, decolonization is not so much a question of open science and question of open access and all of that. Surely that matters, and that matters to a lot of people, and I respect that scholarship. For me, that's not the game. In my view, the game is how science is driven towards dismissing, disqualifying pluralities of ways of knowing from what we might call progress, what we might call sustainability. Yeah. So if decolonized technology has to stop doing that dismissal, disqualification of other ways of knowing and being. And only then can we get to a space where we can then talk about what alternative sciences might look like. Of course, there's a lot of discussion in Euro-American scholarship, in STS in particular, about what is slow science, what is people science, what is grassroots innovation. As you know, Rob, you have contributed to some of that literature too. But I think we need to move beyond just looking at these alternative possibilities by also bringing the beast at the center. What is it that constantly makes science and technology in this particular fashion, driven by imaginations of control, driven by these bids for toxic extraction, et cetera, et cetera. So unless we confront the heart of science, we'll be playing at its margins. And that's at least the plea here and the proposal in the call to arms.
That implies a transformation of science itself.
Absolutely, at the heart of it. And that, there are certain fields of science that are better, of course, disposed towards making that decolonial move. Perhaps environmental toxicology is one of them. Perhaps certain fields of history, philosophy are some of them. And they're already in education, social work and education, perhaps those fields. They're already, and I can see the discussion since I've been reading up here for the last 6, 7, 8, maybe longer, 7, 8 years now, that I can see how those fields are at the center of these discussions. They're having these discussions, yeah. Archaeology is having these discussions too. But then there are certain other areas, there's nothing like that. Where is this in geneticists are not having this discussion?
And engineers as well, that's how we were trained.
Engineers are also not having this discussion, yeah? So I think that's where a transformation, significant, solid transformation is required on that side of science and technology.
Thank you, Saurabh. We have to stop here for time reasons. I think that was an excellent contribution, and thank you so much. You've been very generous with your time over the last couple of days and sharing all your insights and knowledge, and I'm great and very thankful that you came all this way down. And
thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. It's my first time in Australia, so I couldn't, I've enjoyed myself. So thank you. All right. Thank you for all the hard work in putting all of this together as well. I know it's not easy to organize events, May. So thank you.